My name is Megan Johnson, and I'm actually in the process of learning JavaScript, and have been doing so for probably about a year now. I wouldn't proclaim that I'm any expert. I'm not at that guy's level over there, but it's coming along slowly. But along my journey, I've actually found a couple of things, and just to kind of explain why this is even important to me is that I'm actually a graphic designer. So at least I was many moons ago, and so I'm in this transitional phase where I'm moving from the graphic arts into web development. That doesn't mean I've never done any web development. I've actually been doing it for quite a while, but when I started, it was a much simpler time. JavaScript wasn't even important. So now it kind of is. So for me, trying to marry essentially the importance of JavaScript with things that matter to me when it comes to visuals is kind of important. It actually helps me kind of combine things or bind, these ideas all together. So I found this little acorn basically, and I thought it was kind of interesting, so I wanted to share it with all of you. So changing CSS custom properties dynamically with JavaScript. Anyway. So you'll probably hear me kind of go back and forth basically when it comes to CSS custom properties and the title of CSS variables. And I'll explain that as we move along. Actually, I'll move along to the bottom of that slide there. So CSS variables are custom properties which start with a double dash, which is not a very attractive syntax, but there's a reason for that. Essentially, we have Sass and we have less, and they're not trying to replace essentially either one of those options. Actually, this is supposed to be working, it's supposed to work basically with those options. So we needed something that would determine, or separate essentially from Sass and from less, and so we have the double dash instead of using the $ or the @ symbol. So the reason why these properties, these custom properties are kind of cool is that unlike Sass and less, it doesn't need any compiling of any kind, so there's no need for that. So it basically leaves it to be dynamic in a sense. So you can still change things basically within the browser after Sass and less have actually run. So it's very flexible in that sense. So CSS variables can be used with Sass and less, and it's compatible with current CSS parsers, therefore future-proof. That's the other reason why we have the double dashes basically in place. So how do we reference these things? So we can actually name a lot of these things. It's arbitrary as far as making the names for these things. So we can name them pretty much anything we like. Same with CSS. But we actually call it by using a var essentially. So that's where this variable idea kind of comes into play, and why you probably hear this kind of interchangeable CSS custom properties and CSS variables. So how is CSS variables different from Sass and less? Well, Sass and less are preprocessors and cannot be changed after they've been compiled, unfortunately. But the difference is that the CSS variables actually are live. It can be updated at any point, which is very, very cool. You can also set fallbacks. So of course the next question is it compatible with all the browsers? Well, of course not. So, but there are options. We can actually set up some fallbacks for it, and we can actually use the @support option as well. So here's a list. I've made a little screenshot basically of the obvious, of course. It's always red down here, isn't it? So yeah. But that's okay. You can actually use the @supports option for that if you really needed to support that level of IE. So not a big deal. So let's get into the view. I hope that this will work. So I'm not going to be using VS Code or anything. I'm actually going to use CodePen. So bear with me here. Can everybody see that code?
Yeah. Yep.
That better?
Yeah.
You want it larger? I can do that.
A tab would be awesome.
Perfect. All right. Okay. Whew. That's what you get for buying a used computer. Anyway. Okay. So I wanted to give you a couple of demonstrations of how this actually works. So I've got some very basic HTML and CSS happening here. So I know that this is obviously not about CSS, but it's kind of like this intro, right? It's a starter drug, right? How many of you are actually comfortable using CSS? Okay, phew, awesome, awesome. So nothing here should be all that new. Okay, so basically I have a div and I have a little h2 here, tag essentially in my HTML, and I'm defining a couple of things essentially. So I'm just going to scroll over here and show you the change. Is my time already up?
No,
You're fine.
that's my time being off.
Oh, okay.
So now you've got half an hour.
Great, great. Someone else is speaking, right? Okay. All right. Let me just go ahead and scroll up here. And show this. Maximize. Okay, so essentially what I'm doing here is I'm defining some colors for a couple of things and then calling them essentially. So you'll see that for the background color, I've got this var background. I've actually set this to, this number CC, which is basically a nice little gray there. And I have this little 1 second timeout transition essentially that's happening here. The idea behind this is that you can actually set a lot of these things ahead and essentially change them on the fly whenever you like. And you can do that at any point. And you can actually use JavaScript to actually call these things as well and change them that way if you prefer. But to do just kind of a basic, I guess, layout of how this would actually work, you can kind of see that I'm starting to call things at the beginning or create things at the beginning. And then I'm actually calling them afterwards to put them into place essentially. So this is kind of a very basic kind of idea of like how this would actually work. So I do have a couple of other things here that I wanted to share with you. If I can get to the right screen. Here. Kind of building up on this concept. So there it is. All right. So this one's a little more simple. But something is obviously very different here. So now I'm actually calling it or creating them at the root level, essentially. You can see that I've created a main font and a brand color. And left a little note here. So the var function accepts a second parameter, which specifies a fallback value. So if for some reason, that font, that mitor, whatever you want to call it, is not acceptable or cannot be found, essentially, we have sans serif actually as a default to fall back on, obviously. And we can do that in other ways, too. So the variable is specified in the first parameter is not defined, then the second value will be used instead. There are some situations where that wouldn't work, because you have to keep in mind that CSS is a declarative language. So it can't go back and forth essentially if something doesn't work out. It'll actually parse through and actually get to a point where it's like it just tosses things out. If it's not there, it just keeps on going essentially and it never goes back. So I've actually gathered here this font family. Not only have I called it, this var from main font, I have also another fallback just in case that one doesn't work for any reason. So I have kind of duplicate fallback essentially for the sans serif, which is kind of nice to have in case something doesn't happen. Now, for some reason, if, let's say, the color var brand color is not defined, blue actually won't show up. It'll actually go back to its initial value, essentially, because like I've said, it's going through the code, essentially, it's doing its cascade thing, and it will not actually go back and call something, so it'll actually just throw it out. So, let's
So you're saying where you use brand color, because of the way you define brand color, it won't, it'll fall back to that initial default value that you set up, not this blue?
Right, so,
Okay.
yeah. So essentially, yeah, that's exactly what's happening. So for some reason, I forgot to set this, but I tried calling it, then it's just gonna toss the whole thing out and go back to the initial value for the default of the browser, essentially. So, and that could be a number of things. It could either be, for this situation, it might be a black color, it might be transparent if it were a background, or something like that. So it actually wouldn't just go to the blue. So it just kind of depends. So if, it just depends on basically the order of things, essentially, is what I'm trying to get at. So now if I decided to declare that brand color after I've tried calling it, then maybe the blue would actually work as a default, fallback basically, maybe.
Can you
But-
have two CSS files included in a page and one referring to variables from another?
I've never tried it. I don't see why it wouldn't work though. Unless there's any conflict. So if you're using the same name, that would be a conflict.
Right. But like having a bar defined in one but not used in the others.
Yeah. I don't see why that would be an issue. As long as it's I don't know why I'm holding on to that. Okay, moving on. Back to this. Okay. So I apologize for the Sesame Street colors. I was trying to keep my color systems pretty simple. I was using all kinds of goofy things like Sandy Brown. Why not? Anyway. All right. What did I just do? Okay. So, again, I'm setting a couple of things at root. And of course, I can call these things at any point. And the other thing is too is that this is kind of an unusual thing that you can actually change these things also inline. You can shove this inline as a style, an inline style, essentially, if you wanted to. And I think I have an example of that in a different set of code. But anyway. Okay. All right. So I did leave myself a note here. All right. So the rule below redefines. Sorry for the misspelling. The main background and the main color variable with the scope of the container, essentially. So there's a couple of things that are happening here. So even though I've created these things at the very top and the very root, I can actually use the same names within a scope, essentially. And all of you that use JavaScript regularly, you understand scope, essentially. So that's exactly what's happening here. So even though I have very similar names, because it's within a scope, essentially, I can identify them differently, essentially. And that's the reason why we have these differences between the two blocks, or the two boxes here. So I have this, these things defined basically within that scope. Okay, so when the panel uses the variables, they resolve to the values defined to the dark container rather than to the root. Notice you didn't have to restyle the panel or apply any additional classes. So again, I'm doing this within scope rather than just changing it from the outside at the root. So it's flexible in that way that you can get very, I guess, drill down basically and to do different things in different areas depending on what your needs are. So I am getting to the JavaScript, I swear. That's the next one, I swear.
So, Megan, I guess I'm missing the point.
Yeah.
If you want to do it a different color in the second div, why don't you just call it a different color in the second div? Why do you?
Well, this is the cool thing
Why
that
do you
you're
need
asking.
the variable?
This is actually a very good question because.
You're welcome. I don't know why, but you're welcome.
Well, so there's this problem, I guess, is like a communication sort of issue between developers and designers. And oftentimes designers will be asking for changes, on the fly. Oh, you're all smiling. So you know what I'm
You
talking
just don't
about.
understand us. That's
Oh,
all.
yeah. I'm trying. So actually, I kind of feel like this solution is actually one of those things that kind of builds bridges between designers and developers, because it's one of those things that developer can set it up in a way where it allows the designer to change their minds and change their colors and do whatever they like, basically, however they like. So you're doing things that are like a component sort of way. So you're creating these components essentially and allowing the developers, essentially, or the designers, I should say, to go ahead and edit them without knowing anything about JavaScript. So we're kind of getting there essentially.
Sorry, I'll shut up.
It's okay.
So Megan, is the only what's the difference between those two panels? Is it just the class on the panel that was making those?
So one is actually at the root level, and the other one was actually within scope. So
But
everything.
the selector was on the panel for the second one?
Let me open it up again so we can.
Yeah, I think that was the scope, was
Okay.
one, I assume called light, and another one.
Yeah, leave it
Yeah.
at that level, and then you can see the second one is dark,
Right.
but it's the
So-
same HTML.
Let me just increase the size a bit. Okay. So let's go ahead and document that. All right. So
There's
we.
the default values gets from the root for dot panel,
Right.
and then the other one is different ones?
Other one. Notice they're the same names, but they're actually in scope now. So they're
In
different
scope
colors.
with a different selector?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
But the HTML for both things is exactly the same.
Well,
No, the other one
No.
is dark,
Except for
a
dark.
class of dark.
Exactly.
What the hell's a sign?
You gotta learn your
Dude.
tags, man, come on, learn your
Welcome
elements.
to 2018, Mr.
I honestly, my opinion is the sides are kind of useless, but you know, it exists, so whatever.
I have a question. If you open the CSS,
Yes.
I don't have it.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
And so at this point, you have dark,
Mhm.
and you have the, those two variables, main BG and main color. So if you went out, I don't even know. So if you went to, so I guess if something came later from dark and they use main BG, would it go back to the root? Or is this main BG now set for the rest of the
So
document?
this is what the meaning of scope basically is. So you see these curly brackets basically. So it's basically sandwiching that code specifically for .dark. So
So if you have something later, like,
Mhm.
and you use,
So her second panel, if I'm not mistaken, is actually wrapped in another element the aside with the class name of dark.
Exactly.
But inside of that is just another panel. So,
well, what I'm wondering is if you had a third panel.
So keep in mind it's the cascade, right?
Right.
So we started at the root, and then we're moving down essentially, and we've created this single component essentially, and has its own scope of basically the directions, declaring what these things should be essentially. So I can see what you mean, like, so it is kind of weird because we have these similar names, but because it is basically sandwiched within this particular component, there is no conflict actually happening because everything that we've already defined at the root has already taken place essentially. So it's just
Oh,
kind of
right.
picking off essentially as it comes down the cascade.
Yeah.
So it's not source code, it's not source code order, it's
Exactly.
cascade order.
Exactly.
It's cascade
Get this
order.
guy up here.
He can get his own.
No, that's awesome. That's exactly that's exactly
Because
the
you
difference.
would kind of think, I mean, source code order still matters, because if you define the variable, it's still gonna follow. But once you're within a .dark, only stuff lower, more specific
Yes.
Yeah.
in the selector or a child of
Specificity.
would
Yes.
use those values. CSS is so obvious. I don't like it actually, but
I'm glad somebody likes it. Most developers just hate CSS, and I understand. I mean, I get it. You can't just put it in a console and say, "Is this gonna work?" And it doesn't. You know, you don't know why. It doesn't tell you why it's not working. You just have to kind of figure it out. So, yeah. But the one thing I do like about CSS, and this is just a little side tangent, is that no matter what I do in CSS, the content, you know, of what it is my page is still something's going to show up. You know, like with JavaScript, you know, something's going to show up. It did
Yep,
hurt.
totally true. Totally true.
I like that.
It may not look right, but it's
It may not look pretty, but
CSS is
something
the
will be there.
worst. Is it a language ever made?
oh come on.
It's getting better though.
I was just,
So there's a
CSS
lot of cool
grid is
stuff
rough.
going
Okay,
around.
calm
You know,
down.
it's
Calm down.
it's layout that has always sucked, and with Flexbox we got a lot closer, and now with CSS grid
This
display,
grid is awesome.
we're getting much
I
closer.
so wanted to talk about that, but I know it's not JavaScript.
Well,
so.
we can do that. That's close enough. We need that.
Really?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
If you
Something
want
you
it,
can
you
use
got
for
it.
work.
That's not React, is it? I said it's anything that's not React.
Yeah, but I gotta tie it back to React somehow, right?
Yep. Okay.
He's not gonna let me off the hook. No way.
Okay. Here's a line of React. It's got a class in it, and off you go.
All right, so as promised, I do have JavaScript, and yes, I am using var, but it works.
All the best people do.
So please excuse the var. So anyway, let's get to the presentation mode. All right.
I like to use it, but you could just change it.
Shut up.
All right. So getting back to Mark's question, why does this even matter, right? So we're talking about this relationship between the person who's writing the CSS versus the person who's writing the JavaScript, right? And it may not be the same person. So having these things written out in a kind of a component sort of way actually allows a little bit of, I guess, some relief between these two parties who are constantly fighting over, you know, what needs to be done and needs to be changed, and how it should, you know, if it needs to be, you know, changed at all, and how much time it takes to change it. I think that's really the big thing, is a lot of developers don't like doing twice the work, and I understand. I get that. I don't like doing it twice for you. So anyway, so here is basically an example of calling something essentially and changing it essentially on the fly. So a developer could definitely do that on their own, or they could set it up very easily so the designer could do it on their own. It just kind of depends on how this relationship is actually going to work out. And obviously they have to have an agreed communication about how to do that. So, but this is the option to actually do some of that kind of stuff. So we can actually call it and we can change it very easily, essentially. So any elements inheriting the main background property will update basically with this new value. It changes in the background of the first panel to the dark khaki that I've chosen here. And the secondary panel remains unchanged, and it is still inheriting the property from the dark container. So, which is really cool. So we're actually calling this thing, and we're making sure that it's still some kind of string, essentially. That's what that console log thing is about. And making sure that we can actually change it pretty much on the fly. So it's kind of a nice thing. So instead of having to, oftentimes what we do when we're writing CSS is we're repeating ourselves very often. So rather than repeating these colors constantly, setting them basically at the root level and then changing them as needed is a lot easier than going through all of the code and finding all of your incidences basically of this particular color or font or anything like that. So again, everything is time sensitive. Obviously we want to code as quickly as possible. So this is the reason why we would actually have something like this. Just basically scraping time off to make these kinds of changes essentially. So that pretty much concludes my talk as far as introducing these two things. And I don't know, does anybody have any?
I have a question.
Yes,
I
yes,
think
yes.
that's cool. I mean, I've always used Sass for variables
Mhm.
because then you can do like lighten and darken. Because
Yeah.
I'm not a designer, so I can only do the most rudimentary changes. Be like, oh, I want this to be a little deeper red,
Right.
or lighter red, or whatever.
Right.
Could you use something like, you could do this programmatically, I can imagine, if you wanted to give the end user more control. Like if you had different themes, maybe, where you could say, I want a reddish theme.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you wrote enough JavaScript, right, you could update the variables appropriately,
Oh yeah.
right? So
Oh yeah. I mean that's the whole point of, like, you know, basically giving that freedom over, you know, to that designer or user or whatnot to do that. But yeah, I mean, it's not intended to replace Sass or Less or anything like that. Those are, I don't really know much about Sass and Less. I've always, you know, coded everything, you know, in native CSS. I don't bother with those other things. But there's always going to be some give and take. You know, some Sass and Less, you know, do other things better, and this just happens to be, you know, a relatively more flexible, you know, kind of option. So I think the big takeaway is this, the dynamic nature of it as far as an option goes, because SAS, unless won't allow you to do that kind of stuff on the fly. So
Right.
once it parses, that's it. That's how it's going to display.
It's really just dumping out a preprocessor, right? So
Right.
can you do variables let you do anything fancier, or it's just really set and get? That's all you can do with them.
What do you have in mind exactly?
Well, I was thinking like lighten and darken for colors, or like change opacity. I guess that's just a number, so that's one.
It does.
So-
I mean, there is some calc that can be, I guess, involved essentially. Are you familiar with the calc option?
Also, like CSS calc, or
Yeah. So there's a little bit of that. I also saw a demonstration of using a mouse over option to get things to move around. Essentially, they had I think it was just a background image kind of thing, but they were using the mouse to move it around essentially. So they were using JavaScript to set those, the listener essentially for that, and then just clicking on it and moving around the background. So there's a lot that can be done. If you can grab it, you can change it essentially.
right. Okay,
So-
thanks.
Yeah.
Can you use these at all to, I guess, like the first couple things that popped in my mind would be like multiple backgrounds, multiple shadows, but then also simple things like transitions, where you kind of one line to transition. You say height this many milliseconds, and an easing. If you had that, is that treated just kind of like a singular value? Is there any way to reach into that value and just change, for example, the timing on that, or the easing?
So are you referring mostly to animations essentially, or
Well, I was thinking that. I was thinking
or transitions?
when you're doing like gradients or shadows, you can have comma
Yeah.
separated values, or you could do the same thing with multiple backgrounds on a single element, and you've got just comma separated resources of some sort. Are you always changing the entire value when you're using a variable if you want to set it to something else, or can you reach into it and say, here's my variable for transition would be a simple example where you have, or like a one-line border.
Yeah.
So you say border 1 pixel solid green. Can you reach in and change the 1 pixel to 2 pixel without worrying about the other two values, or is it all just set the entire thing and you're done?
Yes. And I
Yes.
think I have an example. I think I do. Okay, so for border, so I used just Sandy Brown, but if I had set basically a CSS variable, I could have easily just put in, let's see, basically var, and let's see. So I can specify the color if I wanted to. I can basically put a var for the
Each
width.
of the, you
I
could-
can put
you
a
could
var.
3 bars in
Right.
there.
So, but you got to be kind of careful with it because there's no concatenation happening. There's this kind of tricky essentially. So you couldn't just string them all together basically. So you were asking if you could do it one by one, or if you could do them all at once essentially, or
Yeah.
multiple things.
Well, so I get that, like what you're saying right now, that totally makes sense, and I guess that answers part of my question. But then what I was kind of implying as well is, so let's say you've got this right here. Let's say you converted all 3 of those values to variables, right? So you've got one for the width, and one for the line type, and one for the color.
Yeah.
Could you then make all of that a variable called, border bar or something, where now, do you know what I mean? Like, can you piece all these together, and now you've got a single variable that I could just change one element of?
The answer is no.
No.
The answer is definitely no. Because like I said, you can't put all those. There's so many differences basically between all of those different points. It just it can't be done. You have to do it one by one essentially. So I guess you wouldn't want to get carried away and start putting var on
I guess that
every
makes sense
single.
because the variables are values, not properties.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So, and you wouldn't want to get carried away with that anyway.
I
Can
do.
you imagine
I
the
wanna
length?
get
I mean,
caught.
I think the whole point. I think the whole point is they're trying to
Shows
code
all the
less,
carried
right? Not code more and actually write longer lines essentially. So that would be kind of crazy. But yeah, it's kind of too bad that we can't do that. I think it is coming in the future. I don't know, how far in the future, but something like that will be coming along. So but we'll see how it plays out.
And there's Houdini, and you heard about Houdini. So basically, you can access anything in CSS using JavaScript. They have typed object model. Basically, you can
Yeah.
set all these properties using typed object model right now in Chrome. But Houdini and you can do it. You can do all these things in JavaScript. Basically, they're exposing the CSS object to JavaScript.
He's got it.
Thank you very much.